there was a moment when Italian prisoners stopped being prisoners. Not because they escaped, not because the war ended, but because something happened that they never expected, never imagined possible. These men, enemies of America, captured soldiers who had fought against everything the United States stood for, fell in love. Not with a person, not with a place, but with an entire country. And it happened so gradually, so unexpectedly, that most of them didn't even realize it was happening until it was too late to stop. Until they had to choose between the country they were born in and the country that had captured their hearts. In the autumn of 1943, over 51,000 Italian soldiers found themselves on ships crossing the Atlantic Ocean. These weren't volunteers. They were prisoners of war, captured in North Africa after Italy's military collapsed, now being transported to camps scattered across the United States. Most of these men had never wanted to fight. They'd been conscripted from poor villages in Sicily, Calabria, Tuscany, places where Mussolini's promises of imperial glory meant nothing compared to the daily struggle of survival. They'd fought because they had to, not because they believed. But 20 years of fascist propaganda had still shaped what they expected from America. They'd been taught that Americans were culturally inferior, materialistic, violent, a mongrel nation of gangsters and criminals with no history, no culture, no soul, and now they were America's prisoners. The men on those ships expected harsh treatment, perhaps cruelty, certainly deprivation. That's what prisoners got. That's what they'd been taught. What they got instead would change everything. Among these thousands of prisoners was a baker from Naples. Let's call him Antonio, because that's what many of them were named. Good, Catholic Italian boys far from home. Antonio was 28 years old. He'd left behind a wife and 2 daughters in a city that was being bombed to rubble. He hadn't heard from them in over a year. In the pocket of his threadbare uniform he carried a photograph. His family, standing in front of their small bakery. The photo was 3 years old, taken before the war, before the hunger, before the bombs. He looked at that photograph every day and wondered if they were still alive. Antonio expected nothing from America but survival. Maybe not even that. The first meal on the ship confused him. Fried eggs. Multiple eggs. Not the single monthly egg Italian civilians were rationed. Bacon. Strips of real meat. White bread so soft it compressed in his hands like a cloud. Real butter. Real coffee with real sugar. He ate slowly, waiting for someone to snatch the tray away and laugh at his gullibility. No one did. The American sailors just served food with bored efficiency, like this was normal. Like feeding enemy prisoners luxuriously was just another day's work. It's propaganda, Antonio told the man next to him. It can't last. But it did last. The meals came 3 times a day, every day, for the entire Atlantic crossing. Breakfast of eggs and bacon and pancakes with maple syrup. Lunch of sandwiches with thick slices of ham. Dinner of roast chicken and mashed potatoes and apple pie. Antonio and his fellow prisoners whispered theories. This was a trick, a temporary show. Americans were fattening them up for slave labour. The abundance couldn't possibly continue once they reached the actual prison camps. What these Italian prisoners didn't know, what they couldn't know because it contradicted everything they'd been taught, was that the abundance wasn't a show. It was just the beginning. When Antonio arrived at his camp in Missouri, one of over 500 POW camps built across America, he stepped into a reality that made no sense. The camp sat in rolling hills that reminded him of Tuscany. Green pastures, wide sky, space that went on forever. The barracks had electricity, indoor plumbing with flush toilets, hot showers, central heating for winter, screened windows to keep out mosquitoes. Antonio had grown up in a Naples tenement where 8 families shared a single outdoor toilet. His family's apartment had never had hot running water. And here he was, an enemy prisoner, living better than he ever had as a free man in Italy. The confusion, that sense that something didn't add up, started to shift into something else. Something Antonio didn't want to name. It started with the food. Every morning, eggs, bacon, toast with butter and jam, oatmeal, fresh fruit, milk, coffee with sugar. Every lunch, sandwiches, soup, salad, dessert, and every dinner, meat, beef, pork, chicken, with potatoes, vegetables, bread and pie, or cake or ice cream. Antonio worked in the mess hall. He saw the numbers. The camp consumed 2,000 pounds of beef per week, 5,000 loaves of bread, 3,000 dozen eggs, 1,000 gallons of milk, and he watched, with a mix of horror and awe, as surplus food was thrown away because military regulations required fresh preparation. Perfectly good roast beef dumped into garbage bins because it had sat in a warming tray for 3 hours. In Naples, people were eating cats. 3 months into captivity, Antonio volunteered for a work detail, 80 cents a day in camp scrip, and a chance to see more of this bewildering country. He was assigned to a farm 15 miles from camp. A man named William Hoffman owned 500 acres of land, more land than Antonio's entire village had farmed collectively. Hoffman was a German-American in his 50s, stocky, sunburned, with hands like slabs of beef and a tendency to spit tobacco juice while he talked. The first day, Hoffman demonstrated the tractor, a John Deere that roared like thunder and could plough 100 acres in a day, work that would take Antonio's village a month with oxen and hand ploughs. Antonio stood there, watching this single machine accomplish what would take dozens of men weeks to do, and something shifted in his chest. Not anger, not even envy, wonder. At noon, Hoffman's wife Margaret drove out to the field in a pickup truck. She brought lunch, sandwiches with thick slices of ham, cheese, lettuce and tomato, potato salad, corn on the cob, apples, iced tea. The Hoffmans sat with the prisoners and ate the same food. Margaret asked Antonio about his family. He showed her the photograph he carried, his wife Maria, his daughters Lucia and Francesca. Margaret's eyes went soft. "They're beautiful," she said in slow, careful English. "I got 3 boys, all overseas, 1 in France, 2 in the Pacific." She looked at Antonio, really looked at him, and Antonio saw something in her face that made his throat tight. Her sons were fighting men like him, and here she was, feeding him, treating him like a human being, like a guest. Antonio worked at the Hoffman farm 5 days a week for 3 months. He learned to operate the tractor, drive the pickup truck, repair fences, tend livestock. He learned American farming techniques, crop rotation, mechanized irrigation, chemical fertilizers. But more than techniques, he absorbed something else, something harder to name. The Hoffmans worked hard, but they weren't driven by fear. They worked because the land was theirs, because success meant a better life for their family, because they believed, genuinely believed, that effort led to reward. In Italy, Antonio had worked hard his whole life and stayed poor. His father had worked hard and stayed poor. His grandfather had worked hard and stayed poor. The Hoffmans worked hard and prospered. They owned their land, multiple vehicles, a house with electricity and indoor plumbing, enough food to feed their family and sell surplus at market, and they weren't special. They weren't nobility or party officials, they were just farmers. Antonio started to realize something that frightened him. He didn't want to go back to Italy. He wasn't alone. Across 500 camps, 51,000 Italian prisoners were having similar experiences, working on American farms, living in American camps, eating American food, meeting American people, and slowly, so slowly most didn't notice it happening, falling in love with America. Not with an idea of America, not with propaganda or promises, but with the reality of America, the abundance, the efficiency, the dignity of work that was rewarded, the kindness of ordinary people, the sense that here, in this strange land, things could be different. You could be different. Then came December 1944, Christmas. Antonio had spent 2 Christmases away from home, 2 years without seeing his daughters, 2 years of not knowing if they were alive or dead. He expected Christmas in the camp to be just another day, maybe a slightly better meal, maybe some acknowledgement of the holiday. What he got was something he would remember for the rest of his life. The town of St. Genevieve, the small Missouri town nearest the camp, organized a Christmas celebration for the prisoners. Churches collected gifts. Women's clubs baked cookies. The Boy Scout troop made Christmas cards, hundreds of them, each one hand-decorated, each one signed with messages like "Merry Christmas from Missouri" and "Peace to all men." On Christmas Eve, the recreation hall was decorated with pine branches and paper snowflakes that American children had made in school. A Christmas tree, donated by the Hoffman family, stood in the corner, decorated with handmade ornaments. The meal was extraordinary. Roast turkey with chestnut stuffing, mashed potatoes with gravy, candied sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, green beans with bacon, fresh rolls with butter, and dessert, pumpkin pie, apple pie, chocolate cake, all with whipped cream or vanilla ice cream. Antonio sat at a long table with other Italian prisoners, staring at the feast in front of him. In Naples, if his family was still alive, they would be lucky to have thin soup and a piece of stale bread for Christmas dinner. Here he sat, an enemy prisoner, eating food fit for a king. "This is wrong," he said quietly in Italian, his voice breaking. The man next to him, a schoolteacher from Turin named Luca, put a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe that's the point, Antonio," Luca said softly. "They're showing us what kind of people they are. Not by what they say, but by what they do." After dinner, a church choir sang Christmas carols in Italian. Tu scendi dalle stelle, astro del ciel, silent night. Their voices drifted through the hall, and Antonio, this tough Naples baker who had survived a war and months in the desert, and the loss of everything he'd known, started to cry. He wasn't the only one. All around the hall, Italian prisoners, enemy soldiers who had fought against America, wept openly as American civilians sang Italian Christmas carols to them. And that was the moment. That was when Antonio and hundreds of men like him fell in love with America. Love isn't always dramatic. It doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it creeps up on you slowly, through accumulated moments of kindness, through meals shared, through work done together, through gestures that say, "You matter," when you have no right to expect it. Antonio didn't wake up one morning and decide to love America. It happened in the taste of real coffee, in the sight of fields so abundant that waste was acceptable, in Margaret Hoffman's smile when she looked at his daughter's photograph, in the Boy Scout who handed him a Christmas card with careful handwriting that said, "Peace to you." It happened in 1,000 small moments that added up to something bigger than he could resist. When Italy surrendered in September 1943 and declared war on Germany, Italian prisoners' status changed. They were offered a choice: stay in camps as regular prisoners or volunteer for Italian service units, working actively to support the American military effort against Germany. Over 45,000 Italian prisoners volunteered, not because they had to, because they wanted to, because somewhere along the way, between the eggs and bacon and the Christmas carols and the farmers who treated them like human beings, they had stopped thinking of themselves as enemies of America. They had started thinking of themselves as something else, friends, admirers. People who wanted America to win because they'd seen what America was and wanted that to triumph over what they'd left behind. In 1946, when the war ended and repatriation began, Antonio faced a choice. He could go home to Naples, try to find his wife and daughters, if they were still alive, return to the rubble of his city and the poverty he'd always known, or he could try to stay in America, somehow. Military regulations didn't make staying easy. Prisoners were supposed to be repatriated promptly, but Antonio delayed. He applied for work extensions. He volunteered for every assignment that might postpone his departure. He wrote letters to Maria, letters that took months to arrive, letters that might never be answered. In one letter, he tried to explain what he'd discovered. "Dear Maria, if you are alive, if this letter reaches you, I want you to know that I am safe. But more than that, I have learned something here, something that makes me ashamed of what we believed, what we fought for. These Americans, they have something we never had, not just food or machines, but an idea. They believe every person has value, even enemies, even prisoners. They believe in freedom, not just for themselves, but for everyone. If I return to you, if God grants us that miracle, I want us to leave Italy. I want to bring you and the girls to America. I want them to grow up in a place where they never know hunger, where they can become anything they dream of." The letter reached Maria in late 1946. She was alive. The girls were alive. Their apartment had been destroyed, but they had survived in a cousin's cellar, eating whatever they could scavenge, waiting for news of Antonio that never came until that letter. Maria wrote back, "Come home first, then we'll decide together." Antonio returned to Naples in 1947. He walked through streets he barely recognized. Entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble, buildings collapsed, bomb craters filled with stagnant water. He found Maria and his daughters living in 2 rooms of a damaged building with no electricity, no running water, no heat. They were thin, painfully thin, but alive. Lucia was 9 years old now. Francesca was 7. They didn't remember him. Antonio held his wife and wept, for what they'd lost, for what they'd survived, for what he was about to ask of them. He told them about America, Not about the war, not about being a prisoner, but about the food, the abundance, the kindness, the farmers who had treated him with dignity, the Boy Scout who had made him a Christmas card, the country where people believed you could be something more than what you were born to be. "I want to go back," he said. "I want us to go back, together." Maria looked at the ruins around them, at their daughter's hollow cheeks, at the future that awaited them in this broken country. "How?" she asked. William Hoffman sponsored them. The farmer from Missouri who had employed Antonio during the war filed immigration papers, vouched for him, offered him a job and a place to live while they got established. In 1950, Antonio Russo, former enemy soldier, former prisoner of war, stepped off a ship in New York Harbor with his wife and daughters, this time as immigrants, as people choosing America. They settled in a small town in Missouri. Antonio opened a bakery, a small shop that made both American pies and Italian pastries, a perfect symbol of what he'd become. Neither fully Italian anymore, not quite fully American yet. But something new, something that could only exist because he had been captured, transported across an ocean, fed eggs and bacon by a nation he'd been taught to hate, and treated with a kindness that broke through every wall he'd built. Antonio wasn't unique. Immigration records show that over 8,000 Italian former prisoners of war returned to America as immigrants between 1945 and 1960. 15% of all Italian POWs held in America chose to come back. They settled in Kansas and Nebraska and Missouri and Texas, in the small towns where they'd been prisoners, near the farms where they'd worked, in the communities that had sent them Christmas packages. They married American women, they raised American children, they built American businesses, and many of them, decades later in their 70s and 80s, would tell anyone who asked about the moment they fell in love with America. It wasn't when they arrived. It wasn't when they tasted their first good meal. It was when they realized that the kindness wasn't going to stop, that it was real, that these people, these supposedly inferior, culturally bankrupt, materialistic Americans, actually believed that even enemies deserved to be treated like human beings. That was when the wall broke. That was when prisoners became admirers. That was when men who had fought against America started dreaming of being Americans. In 1985, the town of San Genevieve held a reunion. Over 200 former Italian prisoners returned from Italy and from across America, many bringing children and grandchildren to show them the place where everything had changed. Antonio Russo was 70 years old. His wife Maria stood beside him. His daughters, American citizens now with families of their own, watched from the audience. He stood before the crowd in the town square and tried to find words. "When I came to this place," he said, in English still touched with an Italian accent after 40 years, "I was full of hate. Hate for Americans, hate for the war, hate for my own failure. I expected cruelty, I expected suffering. Instead, you fed me, you clothed me, you treated me like a human being. You showed me what freedom means, not with words but with actions. You showed me that a good society takes care of people, even its enemies. I didn't just learn this, I fell in love with it. And I want to tell you," his voice broke. He paused to collect himself. "You didn't just save my life, you saved my soul. You taught me what kind of man I wanted to be, what kind of country I wanted my children to grow up in. And because of you, they have. They are Americans, not because they were born here, but because they believe in the same things you showed me. Freedom, dignity, opportunity for everyone." The crowd erupted in applause. Many were crying. Among them was Margaret Hoffman, 93 years old, who had served Antonio lunch in her farm field 42 years earlier. She walked slowly to the podium and embraced him. "I knew you were a good man," she said softly. "I could see it in your eyes. I'm so glad you stayed. I'm so glad you came home." Antonio smiled through his tears. "This is my home," he said. "You made it my home. That's what love does. It transforms strangers into family, enemies into friends, prisoners into citizens, and sometimes, when it's real, when it's earned through 1,000 acts of undeserved kindness, it lasts forever." That was the moment Italian prisoners of war fell in love with America. Not in a single instant, but in accumulated moments of grace that proved more powerful than propaganda, more lasting than ideology, more transformative than any weapon could ever be. They fell in love the way people always do, slowly, unexpectedly, and completely. And for many of them, that love became the foundation of new lives, new families, new dreams, in a country that had shown them something they'd never known was possible. that even enemies can become family if you treat them with enough humanity to show them what family means.